The late afternoon sun poured down in golden streaks, heating the cracked sidewalks of the small town. Most people were inside, hiding from the heavy heat, but the air was suddenly split by a thunderous rumble. One by one, motorcycles rolled down the quiet street, chrome glinting like fire. A dozen leather-clad bikers rode in formation, their black vests stitched with patches that seemed to warn people to stay out of their way. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, some shaking their heads, some whispering to each other about trouble rolling into town. But for 7-year-old Emily, standing barefoot on the corner, those roaring engines didn't mean fear. To her, they meant hope. She had been running for blocks, her thin legs aching, her small lungs burning, but she didn't stop. Tears streaked down her dusty cheeks as she stumbled toward the sound, clutching her little fists. When the bike slowed, preparing to park near a diner, she darted forward with all the desperation a child could carry. "Please," she screamed, her voice shrill and cracked. "Please, help me." The engines cut off almost instantly. The riders exchanged glances, confusion flickering in their eyes. Out of all the people who usually crossed the street to avoid them, here was a little girl running toward them. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with arms covered in ink, swung a boot off his Harley and knelt down to her level. His road name, stitched into his vest, read, Tank. His face was weathered from years on the road, but his eyes softened when he saw the terror in the child's expression. "What's wrong, little one?" he asked, his voice deep and rough, but not unkind. Emily's words tumbled out in sobs. "They're hurting my mama. They're beating her." Her tiny hands gripped his leather vest as if letting go would mean losing her only chance. She pointed frantically down the street toward a sagging house at the corner. Even from here, faint shouting and the crash of breaking glass could be heard. The bikers stiffened. They weren't strangers to violence, they'd lived through plenty themselves, but something about a child begging for her mother's life struck a chord none of them could ignore. Tank's jaw tightened. He looked back at his brothers, and in that single look, the decision was made. "Show us," Tank said, rising to his full height. Emily didn't hesitate. She tugged his massive hand, leading the way at a stumbling run. The bikers followed, boots pounding the pavement in heavy unison. As they drew closer, the sounds grew clearer, angry male voices, another crash, and then a muffled cry of pain. Emily's sobs grew louder. The porch steps creaked under Tank's weight as he climbed them, his crew flanking him like an advancing wall. Without waiting, he slammed the door open. The rotten wood splintered against the wall as a dozen shadows filled the tiny living room. Inside, Sarah, Emily's mother, was huddled on the floor, her arms raised to shield herself. Two men towered over her, one with his fist already raised. They turned, startled, their faces draining of color when they saw who had just walked in. Tank's voice dropped low, a growl that seemed to make the air vibrate. "Party's over." For a long, tense moment, the room froze. The two men standing over Sarah blinked in disbelief at the dozen bikers now crowding the doorway. One of them, a wiry man with a cruel smirk, tried to puff out his chest. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" he snapped, though his voice cracked slightly. Tank didn't move. He simply stared, his dark eyes locked on the man like a predator sizing up prey. The silence was more terrifying than any shout. Then Bear, the largest of the crew, easily 6'5" with arms like tree trunks, took a single step forward. The floorboards groaned under his weight. The second man, the one with a beer bottle clutched tight in his hand, shifted nervously. He muttered something under his breath, lifting the bottle halfway as if ready to swing. But before he could even bring it up, one of the other bikers, a wiry, scar-faced veteran they called Snake, snatched it out of his hand so quickly the man didn't even register what happened. Snake grinned, broke the bottle across his knee with a loud snap, and tossed the shards into a corner. "Bad idea," Snake hissed, his voice like sandpaper. The wiry man tried to laugh it off. "We were just talking, right?" His eyes darted toward the door, calculating his escape. Tank finally spoke, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that made even grown men shiver. "You call that talking? You put your hands on a woman in front of her child." He pointed a finger toward Sarah, who was still trembling on the floor, Emily clinging to her side. "That makes you less than nothing." The man Tank addressed opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to beg, but Bear moved faster than anyone expected. He shoved the man hard against the wall, pinning him there with one massive hand around his collar. The plaster cracked under the impact, dust floating in the air. The man's eyes went wide, his bravado collapsing. "Please," Hey, we didn't mean nothing. He stammered, struggling against Bear's iron grip. You don't mean to leave bruises? Bear thundered, his voice shaking the walls. You think she deserves this? The second man tried to slip toward the door, but another biker stepped in front of him, arms crossed. There was no way out. The weight of 12 men bearing down on them was suffocating. Tank leaned in close, his presence filling the room. Here's what's gonna happen. You're going to walk out that door right now. You're never going to come near this house, or this woman, or that little girl again. And if I ever hear you so much as breathe in their direction, I won't be talking next time. The threat hung heavy in the air. It wasn't shouted, but the quiet promise of violence was enough to make both men pale. The bikers stepped aside just enough to let them leave, though Bear shoved the one he held so hard that he stumbled and crashed into the doorframe. Both men scrambled out of the house, tripping over each other in their rush to escape the pack of leather-clad guardians. The sound of their retreating footsteps echoed down the street until there was nothing but silence. Emily let out a sob, half relief, half exhaustion. She wrapped her arms around her mother. Sarah's lip was split, her arms covered in fresh bruises. She looked up warily at the bikers, unsure if she should thank them or fear them. Tank crouched down again, his voice softening as he addressed her. Ma'am, you don't have to be afraid anymore. You're safe now. One of the bikers pulled a rag from his pocket and gently offered it to Sarah to press against her bleeding lip. Another disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water, setting it on the coffee table in front of her. They moved with surprising gentleness, treating her not like a stranger, but like family. Outside, neighbors had begun to gather, whispering in shock. To them, the bikers were menacing figures who never meant good. Yet what they were seeing was something else entirely. Rough men with scarred hands showing compassion where no one else dared. To Emily, there was no doubt. These weren't villains. These were her heroes. The house was quiet now, except for the soft sobs of Emily pressed into her mother's side. Sarah's chest rose and fell rapidly, still shaking from the ordeal, but the look in her eyes was different, less fear, more disbelief. She had been bracing herself for another blow, for more cruelty. Instead, a band of strangers in leather jackets stood in her living room, acting like guardians sent from nowhere. Tank motioned to one of his men, a lean biker with sharp eyes named Ghost. Call it in, he said simply. Ghost pulled out his phone, and minutes later the distant wail of sirens filled the air. The bikers didn't move, didn't leave Sarah and Emily alone for a second. They formed a protective wall in the small house, their boots planted like they were ready to defend against anyone else who dared to come through that door. When the police arrived, lights flashing red and blue against the peeling paint of the house, Sarah instinctively stiffened. She'd had bad experiences before, people turning a blind eye, officers dismissing her bruises as accidents. But this time, she wasn't alone. Emily clung to Tank's hand as if he were a giant she could trust. Those men, Sarah whispered, pointing with a trembling hand toward the street, they've been coming around for weeks. Tonight they said if I didn't give them money, they'd. Her voice broke. She couldn't finish. Tank's voice carried weight as he spoke to the officers. We saw them in the act. Put that in your report. And make sure she doesn't have to see them again. His tone brooked no argument. The officers nodded, taking the statement seriously. With the bikers standing over them, there was no brushing this aside. The two men were picked up a block away, shoved into the back of squad cars, their earlier arrogance replaced with pure fear. After the chaos calmed, Sarah sat on the couch, holding Emily tightly. She looked up at Tank, her voice trembling. I don't even know how to thank you. Tank shook his head. You don't owe us a thing. Just keep that little one safe. But the bikers didn't just leave after that night. They returned the next day with tools, hammering and sawing until the broken door was fixed, the shattered window replaced. Another day they came back with groceries, bags of fresh food stacked in Sarah's kitchen. Emily squealed with delight when Bear brought her a stuffed teddy bear, enormous in her small arms. Slowly, the fear in Sarah's eyes gave way to something else, trust. Tank explained their reason one evening as the crew sat on her porch, sipping coffee Sarah had offered. Most of us grew up around pain, he admitted. We know what it's like to feel powerless. That's why we don't turn our backs when we see it happening again. No one lays a hand on family. And like it or not, you two are family now. Emily's face lit up whenever she heard the thunder of their bikes. She'd run outside barefoot, waving wildly until the bikers stopped to greet her. One day, They surprised her with a tiny leather vest, her name stitched carefully across the front. On the back, a patch was sewn in bold letters, "Protected by the Brotherhood." Word spread through the town. People who once crossed the street to avoid the bikers began nodding respectfully. Parents whispered to their children about the night the scary men on motorcycles became heroes. The story passed from neighbor to neighbor, growing into legend. And in every telling, the ending was always the same. The little girl ran to the bikers crying, "They're beating my mama," and the bikers didn't just save her. They gave her a family, and they left a mark of kindness on a town that would never forget.